When the snow falls thick across the valley that winter, a man steps out of his truck with a dog at his side, and in that single moment, everything changes. The storage unit sits abandoned at the edge of town, forgotten by time and marked with a faded number on its rusted door. Benjamin pushes the key into the lock, his hand steady despite the cold that cuts through his jacket, and Duke, beside him, shifts his weight, his ears perking forward. The dog's entire body tenses as they step inside. The air smells wrong to Duke, metallic, old, layered with something that triggers every instinct his military training ever embedded in. His bones. His handler knows that look. Benjamin has seen it before, on missions overseas, when Duke detected something human eyes could never see. The dog's low growl vibrates through the dim space, and Benjamin's own instincts, honed by decades of service and sacrifice, suddenly ignite with the same urgent awareness. Something in this storage unit is not what it appears to be. Something in here holds a secret that someone desperately wanted to stay buried. And as Benjamin watches his dog's muscles coil with recognition, he realizes that this $50 investment is about to unearth far more than he bargained for. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you never miss a story of courage, loyalty, and the incredible bonds that remind us why we fight. Benjamin's story begins long before this cold winter day. In the valley, he served his country with honor, carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders through years most people could never comprehend, and came home carrying scars that didn't show on his skin but lived deep in his soul. The military had shaped him into something beyond ordinary, a man who could read a room in seconds, who understood the subtle language of danger, who knew how to survive when survival seemed impossible. But coming home as a black veteran meant walking into a different kind of battlefield. He faced the casual suspicion in strangers' eyes when he walked into a store, the way store owners watched him more carefully than anyone else. The times police officers pulled him over on quiet streets and approached his window with hands already tense. Head survived firefights in distant lands, only to come home and feel the weight of being seen as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. The world outside the military structure had proven harder in many ways than the world within it. Benjamin had learned to carry that too. With the same quiet dignity he carried everything else. When he found Duke, the connection was immediate and profound. The dog was a former military working dog himself, retired after years of service, with the same knowing eyes and the same instinct to protect. They recognized something in each other, a shared language of loyalty, a mutual understanding that life had tested them both and they had both endured. Duke became more than a companion. He became the one being on Earth who truly understood what Benjamin had lived through without needing explanations or apologies. The storage unit had come up at an estate auction, listed in the newspaper as being available for $50 to whoever could clear it out and take responsibility for whatever lay inside. Benjamin saw it as an opportunity, a way to find items he could restore and sell. A small business venture that might generate income without requiring the kind of interactions that had become exhausting. He didn't know whose unit it had been, didn't know what history was locked behind that door, didn't know that walking through it with Duke would crack open a mystery that had been sealed away for years. What he did know was that the valley around the storage facility was beautiful in its desolation, mountains rising in the distance, thick forests of evergreens stretching across the landscape, and when winter came, the snow transformed everything into a quiet, isolated world. The nearest neighbors were miles away. The nearest town was a 20-minute drive. Out here, secrets could stay buried indefinitely. Out here, no one asked too many questions. That isolation would become both their shelter and their danger. The moment Benjamin stepped through that storage unit door with Duke, he felt the familiar weight of entering unknown territory settle across his shoulders. His dog's instincts were screaming, and Benjamin had learned long ago to trust a working dog's awareness more than his own eyes. Duke was not reacting to an unfamiliar space or dusty objects. Duke was reacting to a presence, a scent, something that spoke of human activity and human intention layered into the air itself. Benjamin's breath steadied, his mind shifted into the analytical mode that combat had taught him, and he began to move through the storage unit with the methodical patience of someone trained to notice everything. What they would discover in the coming days would pull them both into a story that spanned decades, connected lives across generations, and would ultimately require every ounce of courage, loyalty, and determination they possessed to see justice finally done. Benjamin's journey to this moment had been written in the language of sacrifice and service. He had enlisted at 22, fresh from a childhood spent in a working-class neighborhood where opportunities seemed scarce and the future felt uncertain. His mother had worried, his father had nodded with quiet pride, and his younger sister had cried at the recruitment station, though she never said why. The military became his university, his family, his purpose. He learned discipline that transformed his body into an instrument of precision, learned tactics that made his mind sharp as obsidian, learned loyalty from brothers in arms who would have stepped in front of bullets for him, just as he would have for them. The years accumulated tours that stretched into months, missions that tested every boundary of human endurance, moments of such clarity and terror that they rewired his understanding of what it meant to be alive. When he finally came home with an honorable discharge and a chest full of commendations, he discovered that the medals and the official recognition meant nothing to people who saw his black skin before they saw his uniform. The VA struggled to understand his nightmares. The civilian world seemed hostile in ways both obvious and subtle, and the brotherhood head found overseas had no equivalent in the towns and cities where he tried to build a civilian life. He worked various job security, construction, maintenance positions that paid bills but never quite reached toward the future head imagined. Years of quiet persistence. Years of waking at 4 a.m. with his heart racing. Years of learning to exist in a world that seemed determined to remind him he didn't quite belong, no matter what head sacrificed to protect it. Duke's story was similarly etched in the language of purpose and devotion. He had been born into a military breeding program, selected as a puppy for certain genetic markers that indicated intelligence, athleticism, and the right temperament for working under pressure. His training began before he could properly process the world, every lesson designed to make him into a weapon and a tool, a living instrument of detection and protection. For 8 years, Duke had served with distinction, his nose leading soldiers away from improvised explosives, his presence calming anxious troops in hostile environments, his loyalty absolute and unwavering. He had earned scars and commendations of his own, had faced dangers that would have broken less resilient spirits, had lost comrades and moved forward because that was what soldiers did. When his military service ended not through injury but through the simple mathematics of age and changing needs, Duke found himself in the civilian world just as disoriented as any veteran. He spent 6 months in a shelter, confused by the absence of purpose, until a veterans rescue organization recognized something in him and connected him with Benjamin. The moment they met, both broken in ways that civilians couldn't quite see, both carrying the weight of service and loss, something shifted in the universe. They recognized their own reflection in each other's eyes. They understood, without needing words, that they had both been shaped by experiences that set them apart from ordinary existence. Together, they could be whole again. Their bond was forged in the quiet moments that followed that initial meeting. Benjamin had adopted Duke through the Veterans Organization, paying the small fee and signing papers that felt ceremonial compared to what they would actually mean. In the weeks that followed, Benjamin learned that Duke wasn't just a dog. Duke was a constant mirror of his own emotional state, a being so attuned to Benjamin's subtle shifts in mood and stress that the dog could sense anxiety before Benjamin himself consciously recognized it. When Benjamin's nightmares came, Duke would wake him with a gentle nudge or a pressed paw, breaking the cycle of terror. When Benjamin felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him, Duke's presence lie existing beside him on the couch, or walking through the neighborhood, or sitting in the truck as they drove became an anchor to the living world. In return, Benjamin provided Duke with purpose again, with the structure and leadership that the dog's military training had wired into his very being. They moved through the world as a team, 2 veterans learning to exist outside the framework that had defined them, and slowly, the loneliness that had threatened to consume Benjamin began to ease. The dog gave Benjamin a reason to get up in the morning that went beyond mere survival. Duke gave Benjamin someone who needed him, who looked to him for leadership and protection, who made Benjamin feel like his service and his skills and his existence still mattered in profound ways. Deputy Marcus had grown up in the same valley where Benjamin now found himself, had known these mountains his entire life, and had become a police officer partly because he understood how easily this isolated community could harbor secrets. Marcus was also a black man, though his experience had differed from Benjamin's in significant ways. He had never served in the military, had grown up with more opportunity than Benjamin's generation had known, but carried his own understanding of what it meant to move through spaces where you weren't entirely welcomed. When Benjamin first arrived in the valley, settling into a small rental house on the edge of town, Marcus had been one of the few people who treated him with simple, straightforward respect. They didn't become close friends immediately, but they developed the kind of cordial nod and wave relationship that develops between people who recognize something of themselves in each other. Dr. Sarah, the veterinarian who would soon become crucial to Benjamin's investigation, ran her practice from a converted house in the valley's small downtown. She was a woman in her 60s, white, brilliant with animals, and possessed of the kind of keen observational skills that made her excellent at noticing inconsistencies and putting pieces together. She had seen Duke once for a routine checkup when Benjamin first moved to the valley, had marveled at the dog's training and bearing, and had mentioned to Benjamin that she'd rarely seen a dog with such obvious military background. Their subsequent conversations had revealed that Dr. Sarah's own brother had served as a military dog handler, and she carried deep respect for both handlers and working dogs. Eleanor represented the human thread that would eventually weave through the entire investigation. A woman now in her 70s, living quietly on the outskirts of the valley, working part-time at the library despite ongoing health struggles. She carried secrets of her own, though she didn't know that those secrets were connected to Benjamin's fate. Eleanor had survived a profound betrayal years earlier, had lost most of her financial security to someone she'd trusted, and had spent the subsequent decade quietly rebuilding her life, piece by piece. She was the kind of woman people overlooked, which had become both her protection and her curse. The storage unit sat on a piece of property that belonged to an elderly man named Garrett, who rented space to various people throughout the year. The facility consisted of 12 identical units, painted industrial gray, arranged in a row at the end of a long driveway that curved away from the main road. During winter, the driveway became treacherous with snow and ice, and few people visited their units. Most of Garrett's tenants were locals who paid their fees regularly and rarely made a fuss. The unit Benjamin had purchased sat at the far end of the row, partially obscured from the main road by a stand of evergreen trees. Beyond the storage facility, the land opened into dense forest that stretched up the mountainside, thick with pine and fir, dark even in daylight, and completely impenetrable during the long winter nights. Snow covered everything in the valley that December, accumulating faster than the plow trucks could clear it, transforming the landscape into a study in white and shadow. The wind came down from the mountains with a voice like something alive, howling through the valleys at night, and the temperature dropped well below freezing. At night, the valley became almost completely silent, except for the wind, and the isolation felt almost absolute. This was the setting where Benjamin and Duke would begin their investigation, where secrets would start to emerge from beneath years of deliberate concealment, and where the snow itself would eventually become both adversary and accomplice in the events to come. Benjamin's first week inside the storage unit revealed layers of mystery that deepened with each afternoon he spent cataloging and organizing. The space itself was approximately 10 feet by 20 feet, climate-controlled but not heated, and filled with boxes, furniture, and various items that suggested someone had simply abandoned their possessions rather than carefully storing them. Duke moved through the space with the deliberate precision of a working dog on assignment, his nose constantly employed, his attention locked on specific areas that made him pause and alert. Benjamin had learned long ago to read his dog's body language the way a musician reads sheet music. Every muscle tension, every shift in posture, every change in breathing pattern communicated precise information. Duke was not alerting to danger in the immediate sense, but rather to the presence of human activity layered into the objects themselves. The first boxes Benjamin opened contained household items, dishes, linens, kitchen equipment, the ordinary detritus of someone's life. But as he dug deeper, he found photographs, documents, and personal papers that began to paint a picture of a woman's life spanning decades. Her name appeared repeatedly in the papers, Eleanor Hartwell. Benjamin found mortgage documents, utility bills, banking statements, and correspondence that all bore her name. He found photographs showing Eleanor at various ages young and smiling at what appeared to be a wedding, middle-aged in front of a house, elderly in more recent photos. The documents were dated across multiple decades, spanning from the 1982 to as recently as 5 years ago. Something had caused someone to carefully collect all of Eleanor's most important papers and store them away. Hidden from view, Duke's behavior intensified when Benjamin opened a particular wooden chest that had been shoved into the back corner of the unit, covered by a tarp. The dog's entire body vibrated with alertness, and he released a low, continuous growl that Benjamin recognized as indicating something significant. Inside the chest, Benjamin found documents that made his military-trained mind immediately understand the gravity of what he was looking at. There were legal papers bearing Eleanor's signature. Documents that had clearly been filed, but then removed from their original locations. There were bank statements showing large transfers of money from Eleanor's accounts to accounts bearing a different name. There were forged power of attorney documents, fraudulent notarizations, and what appeared to be a systematic pattern of financial theft spanning more than a decade. Written in the margins of some documents, in handwriting that appeared repeatedly throughout the papers, was a name, Leopold Chen. Benjamin photographed everything with his phone, careful to document the scene before touching anything further. His military experience had taught him proper evidence handling. An instinct told him that what he was uncovering was significant enough to require official documentation. Duke continued to alert on specific items within the chest, particularly on a folder containing photographs and correspondence that seemed to predate the fraudulent documents. Inside that folder, Benjamin found letters addressed to Eleanor from someone named James, dated from 1968 to 1972. James described military service, expressed deep affection for Eleanor, and in one letter, mentioned that he was being deployed to Southeast Asia. The letters stopped in 1973. A newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, reported that James Patterson, age 26, a soldier from the valley, had been killed in action. Benjamin's hands had steadied as he processed what he was reading, but his heart had begun to race in a different way than physical danger prompted. This wasn't just a storage unit full of stolen possessions. This was a deliberate archive of someone's stolen life, and the theft had begun decades ago with the death of someone Eleanor had clearly loved. Benjamin drove into town that afternoon with Duke riding beside him, the winter light beginning to fade early as it did in December in the valley. He parked at the library and walked inside with his dog, where Eleanor was working her 3-hour shift at the circulation desk. She was exactly as she appeared in the more recent photographs, a woman in her 70s with gray hair worn in a simple style, wearing reading glasses on a chain, moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing chronic pain. When Benjamin approached the desk and began to speak, mentioning the storage unit and asking if she knew anything about it, Eleanor's face had gone completely still. Her hands, which had been organizing returned books, had stopped mid-motion. She had stared at Benjamin for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears, and then she had asked him to come back when her shift ended. They met at a small coffee shop 2 hours later, Eleanor sitting across from Benjamin with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that she never drank, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the coffee shop walls. She had told him a story that spanned 50 years of love, that ended with a telegram informing her that James Patterson had been killed in action, a grief so profound that Shed never married, a slowly building friendship with James' family that had eventually faded as the years accumulated. She had told him about inheriting her house through her savings and careful financial planning, about finally feeling secure in her later years, and then about meeting Leopold Chen 20 years ago at a community event. Leopold had been charming, attentive, interested in her stories about the valley and her life. He had gradually become her friend, and then gradually, through a series of small steps that she could barely articulate even now, he had become someone with access to her financial accounts, her legal documents, and her most intimate secrets. Eleanor had discovered the extent of the theft only after Leopold had essentially disappeared 5 years ago, taking with him approximately $200,000 of her life savings. She had gone to the police, but without clear evidence, and with Leopold having covered his tracks meticulously, nothing had come of the investigation. She had been left with her house but little else, forced to return to work despite her age and health issues, living quietly and trying not to think about the decade of her life that had been stolen along with her money. Benjamin had listened to her entire story without interrupting, understanding as she spoke that this was not simply a case of theft. This was a systematic predation on a vulnerable woman who had the misfortune of being alone, older, and carrying enough grief that she was perhaps more susceptible to manipulation than she might otherwise have been. When Benjamin showed Eleanor the documents Head found in the storage unit, she had wept openly, her hands shaking as she held the photographs of her young self with James, letters she thought had been lost decades ago. She had confirmed that the handwriting on the fraudulent documents was Leopold's, that the storage unit must have been where Head kept his evidence of his crimes, and that she believed he had been planning to either blackmail her with the intimate details of her life, or simply ensure that if she ever tried to pursue legal action, he could destroy all evidence of their relationship. Deputy Marcus had listened carefully when Benjamin came to him with Eleanor's story and the documents from the storage unit. Marcus had run Leopold Chen through various databases and had discovered that Leopold had multiple aliases, a history of similar financial crimes in 3 other states, and was currently wanted in connection with fraud investigations in 2 jurisdictions. Leopold had essentially been operating a long-term predatory scheme, targeting older, isolated individuals, particularly women who had some financial security, gaining their trust, and then systematically stealing from them before moving on. The storage unit appeared to be his archivia collection of evidence from his crimes, that he was keeping either as insurance or out of some deep psychological need to preserve records of his conquests. Marcus had immediately initiated a formal investigation, bringing in state police and federal investigators who specialized in elder fraud. The evidence Benjamin had discovered turned out to be crucial to multiple cases, not just Eleanor's. As the investigation expanded, Marcus had discovered that Leopold was likely responsible for the financial ruin of at least 15 other victims across multiple states. Eleanor was not an isolated case of misfortune, she was one of many, a pattern victim of someone who had made a predatory practice of targeting vulnerable people. Within days of Benjamin bringing the evidence to Marcus, an alert had been issued for Leopold's arrest. Leopold had been located 3 states away, attempting to establish a new relationship with another elderly woman who lived alone. He was taken into custody, and the machinery of law and justice, which moves slowly but sometimes moves decisively, had begun to turn in Eleanor's direction for the first time in years. But Leopold's arrest did not come without consequences, and the danger that Benjamin had begun to sense in those early investigation days suddenly crystallized into something immediate and terrifying. Leopold had made bail through a bail bondsman, and within 48 hours of his release, he had begun what could only be described as a campaign of intimidation directed at Benjamin. He appeared at Benjamin's house in the evening, standing at the end of the driveway, staring at the windows. He called repeatedly, leaving messages that were ostensibly casual but carried unmistakable undertones of threat. He had somehow discovered that Benjamin was the one who had found the storage unit, that Benjamin was the reason his entire operation was unraveling, and Leopold's response was not to accept consequences but to attempt to eliminate the source of his exposure. When Deputy Marcus learned of Leopold's behavior, he had warned Benjamin that Leopold was displaying patterns consistent with escalating violence. Leopold had a history of physical confrontation when cornered, had been arrested twice for assault, and appeared to be someone whose sense of control and dominance was so fundamental to his psychology that losing it triggered dangerous reactions. The investigation was proceeding, Marcus had explained, but the legal process moved slowly, and Leopold would remain free until trial. Benjamin needed to be extremely careful. That warning had come on a Thursday afternoon in December, with snow beginning to fall heavily, and the forecast predicting a significant winter storm would move into the valley by evening. That same Thursday night, Benjamin received a call from a man claiming to be a representative from a property management company, saying there was an issue with his rental house that required immediate attention. Benjamin, his military training making him naturally cautious, had recognized the call as likely fraudulent, but before he could hang up, the man on the phone had mentioned Eleanor by name, had mentioned the storage unit, and had suggested that Benjamin's continued interference in Leopold's legal situation would have consequences for Eleanor's safety. The threat had been explicit and unambiguous. Benjamin had immediately called Deputy Marcus, who had dispatched an officer to check on Eleanor, and Marcus himself had driven to Benjamin's house to discuss the situation. Marcus was deeply concerned that this level of escalation suggested Leopold was unraveling mentally, that his sense of control was deteriorating, and that he might be planning something dramatic. Marcus had suggested that Benjamin consider leaving town temporarily, relocating somewhere safe until Leopold was back in custody. But Benjamin, shaped by decades of military service and the absolute refusal to abandon someone under threat, had declined. He would not run. He would not leave Eleanor vulnerable. He would not allow someone like Leopold to dictate his actions through intimidation. Instead, Benjamin had made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. Benjamin decided that he and Duke would attempt to locate Leopold directly. He knew it was dangerous, knew it violated every reasonable safety protocol, but his military mind was calculating odds and possibilities in the way it had been trained to do. Leopold had made contact, had revealed his location by making phone calls, and Benjamin's experience in reconnaissance and tactical assessment told him that Leopold's threat pattern suggested someone becoming increasingly unstable and unpredictable. The best way to protect Eleanor was to locate Leopold, to understand his intentions, and to provide Marcus with concrete information that might allow for arrest on additional charges beyond the fraud convictions. That Friday morning, as the storm was beginning to intensify, Benjamin had told Duke they were going for a drive. The dog, sensing the shift in Benjamin's energy from calm routine to focused intensity, had moved into working mode, his entire bearing changing to reflect the seriousness of purpose. Benjamin had driven through the increasingly heavy snow toward the address that Leopold had listed on his bail paperwork, a small rental house on the outskirts of a neighboring town, approximately 40 minutes from the valley. The drive had taken nearly an hour and a half through the worsening weather. When Benjamin had arrived at Leopold's address, the house had appeared empty, with no car in the driveway and no sign of occupancy. Benjamin had driven slowly through the neighborhood, looking for any indication of where Leopold might have gone, and that was when Duke had begun to alert. The dog had stiffened in the passenger seat, his nose working the air despite the closed windows and the snow swirling outside. Duke had pressed his paw against the window, a signal that Benjamin understood meant the dog had caught a scent, had detected something significant. Following Duke's alert, Benjamin had driven back toward the valley, following the dog's cues with the absolute trust that comes from years of partnership. Duke had guided him toward the mountain passes that led into the less populated regions beyond the valley, areas where the forest grew denser and the human presence became increasingly sparse. The snow had continued to intensify, and by mid-afternoon, visibility had become severely compromised. Benjamin had known that continuing forward was dangerous, that the storm was reaching the level of severity that could trap vehicles and create genuine life-threatening situations. But Duke's alerts had continued, the dog's intensity undiminished, and Benjamin's tactical assessment suggested that Leopold was moving towards something specific, perhaps a second location, perhaps a place where Leopold had stashed additional evidence or resources. The road had eventually narrowed into what was barely more than a Forest Service road, and Benjamin had recognized that they were entering terrain that was becoming increasingly treacherous. The snow had accumulated so heavily that the road beneath was barely visible. The wind had begun to gust with such force that it rocked the truck. Benjamin's visibility ahead had shrunk to perhaps 50 feet, and the temperature had continued to drop as the afternoon wore on. He had made the decision to turn back, to acknowledge that continuing forward was no longer tactically sound, and he had begun to execute a careful three-point turn in the narrow space available. That was when Duke had released a sharp bark and lunged at the side window, his entire body rigid with alert intensity. Simultaneously, through the swirling snow, Benjamin had caught movementa figure, a person, standing at the edge of the tree line approximately 30 yards ahead of the truck. Leopold stepped out of the snow like something summoned from the storm itself. A man in his early 60s wearing inadequate clothing for the weather, his face twisted with an expression of rage and desperation. Behind him, Benjamin could see what appeared to be a small cabin, partially obscured by falling snow and dense forest. Leopold had a gun in his hand. The weapon was visible in the moment before Leopold moved, and Benjamin's mind processed the threat with the same clarity it had processed countless dangers during military service. This was no longer an investigation or a pursuit. This was a tactical emergency. Benjamin had immediately put the truck into park and reached for Duke's collar, knowing that his dog's instinct would be to attack, knowing that Duke would die attempting to protect him if given the opportunity. Benjamin had held the dog firmly, commanding silence through his grip and his presence, and had stepped out of the truck with his hands visible and empty. Leopold had advanced through the snow, the gun held in a manner that suggested someone with little formal firearms training but enough desperation to make him extremely dangerous. Leopold had begun to shout, his voice nearly lost in the wind, accusing Benjamin of ruining his life. of interfering in matters that were none of his business, of forcing this confrontation through his stubborn refusal to accept Leopold's dominance. Leopold had mentioned Eleanor, had spoken about teaching Benjamin what it meant to lose everything, had made clear that he intended violence before this encounter ended. Benjamin had moved slowly, keeping his hands visible, speaking in the low, calm voice that years of tactical training had taught him to use in volatile situations. He had acknowledged Leopold's rage, without agreeing with Leopold's perspective. He had allowed Leopold to vent without responding defensively to the accusations. Benjamin had been performing the delicate dance of de-escalation, attempting to buy time and space, knowing that backup was not coming, knowing that he was in a remote location during a severe winter storm, knowing that his only advantages were his training, his experience, and his dog who remained in the truck observing everything with absolute focus. But Leopold, whose psychological stability had apparently been more fragile than anyone had realized, had not been receptive to de-escalation. Leopold had taken another step forward, had raised the gun to chest height, and had made a statement that was unmistakable in its intention. Benjamin had one final opportunity to tell him everything he knew about the investigation, about the evidence, about how much of Leopold's operation had been exposed. If Benjamin refused, Leopold would shoot him, would drive to Eleanor's house, and would ensure that she could never testify against him. The winter storm, Leopold had calculated, would conceal the crimes, would delay discovery, and would give him time to flee. It was a plan born of desperation and deteriorating mental function, but it was a plan that Leopold was apparently willing to execute. In that moment, with snow falling so heavily that the world had become essentially white, with wind screaming through the forest with a voice like something alive, with a man holding a gun and operating from pure desperation and rage, Benjamin made his choice. He did not attempt to comply with Leopold's demands. He did not attempt to talk Leopold down further. Instead, Benjamin turned and ran directly back toward the truck, sprinting through the snow with every ounce of speed his body could produce. Leopold had fired, the shot audible even through the wind and snow, and the bullet had passed close enough to Benjamin that he heard it split the air. Benjamin had reached the truck, had yanked open the passenger door, and had released Duke with a single command that the dog had been waiting for his entire life to receive. Duke had exploded from the truck like a weapon finally unleashed, his entire body in motion toward the threat, his voice releasing a sound that was barely canine in its intensity and ferocity. Leopold had fired again, but panic was now competing with rage, and his aim had become erratic. Duke had covered the 30 yards between the truck and Leopold in seconds, moving with the lethal grace of an animal whose entire being had been bred and trained for exactly this kind of engagement. The dog had struck Leopold with the impact of a linebacker, had driven him backward into the snow, and had begun the work that his training had prepared him for. Benjamin had not paused to observe the struggle. He had moved with military efficiency, had retrieved the gun that had fallen from Leopold's hand into the snow, had secured it, and had assessed the tactical situation. Leopold was on the ground beneath Duke, and while the dog was not attempting to kill, Duke was making absolutely clear through his presence and his proximity that Leopold's resistance had become futile. Benjamin had called the sheriff's office from his truck, had reported his location and the situation, and had explained that he had an armed suspect in custody and required immediate assistance. The dispatcher had informed him that in these weather conditions, response time would be at least 40 minutes, possibly longer. Benjamin had then made the decision that would preserve all of their lives. He had locked Leopold in a back storage shed that was attached to the mysterious cabin, had ensured the shed was secure, had verified that it contained nothing that could be used as a weapon or escape tool, and had settled in to wait. He had allowed Duke back into the truck, had examined the dog for injuries. Duke had been grazed by one of Leopold's bullets, but had sustained no serious wound. Had treated the wound as best he could with the first aid supplies he carried. Benjamin and Duke had sat together in that truck for the next 2 hours, watching the snow continue to fall, watching the storm rage, waiting for the authorities to arrive through the impossible weather. When Deputy Marcus finally arrived with backup, navigating the treacherous mountain roads with the careful precision that comes from intimate knowledge of terrain, he had found Benjamin and Duke waiting calmly in the truck, Leopold secured in the shed, and all weapons accounted for. Marcus had immediately taken Leopold into custody, had read him his rights, and had begun the process of documenting the crime scene. Benjamin had provided a detailed statement about everything that occurred, and Marcus had listened with the expression of someone who recognized that he was witnessing something significant. Leopold, faced with the evidence of his fraud crimes, his attempted murder of Benjamin, his obvious threat to Eleanor, and his complete inability to control the situation, had effectively given up. He had confessed to everything: the frauds, the predatory targeting of elderly victims, the financial exploitation, the blackmail threats, and the attempted murder. He had admitted that he had been planning to kill Eleanor as well, to eliminate the witnesses to his crimes, and to disappear into a new identity in another state. The confession had been recorded, had been witnessed by law enforcement, and had essentially concluded any possibility of Leopold avoiding serious prison time. Within hours, his bail had been revoked, and Leopold had been remanded into custody without the possibility of release pending trial. The immediate threat was over, but the encounter in the snow had revealed something else: the depth of danger that had been present all along, the genuine risk that Eleanor had faced, and the stakes of what Benjamin and Duke had accomplished through their investigation and confrontation. In the weeks following Leopold's arrest and confession, the legal machinery that had seemed so slow and uncertain began to move with increasing momentum. The evidence that Benjamin and Duke had recovered from the storage unit, combined with Leopold's own confession, created a prosecution case so overwhelming that Leopold's attorney eventually advised him to accept a plea agreement rather than proceed to trial. Leopold pled guilty to 15 counts of fraud, 3 counts of attempted murder, and multiple counts of elder abuse and financial exploitation. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the calculated nature of his predatory behavior. The restitution he was ordered to pay totaled over $3 million money that would be distributed among his victims, though the reality of collection would likely stretch across decades. Eleanor received the largest single settlement, approximately $180,000, which partially restored the life savings that had been stolen from her. More importantly, though, Eleanor received something that money could never quite restore: the knowledge that her theft had not been her fault, that she had not been uniquely foolish or uniquely vulnerable, but rather had been targeted by a professional predator who had victimized many others. The other 14 victims that investigators identified through Leopold's records also received restitution and, more significantly, received acknowledgement that their experiences had mattered, that their losses had been recognized, and that justice had been served. Eleanor's recovery was neither simple nor linear, but it moved in the direction of healing with a consistency that had seemed impossible during the years of her theft. She reduced her working hours at the library as her financial situation stabilized, allowing her chronic pain conditions to improve with less constant strain. She reconnected with her extended family, people she had isolated herself from during the period of her deepest shame and desperation. She began to speak publicly about her experience with Leopold, participating in elder fraud awareness seminars and community programs designed to help other older adults recognize predatory behavior. In speaking about her trauma, Eleanor found a kind of redemption: not the erasure of what had happened to her, but rather the transformation of her experience into something that could help others. She started a support group for elder fraud victims in the Valley, meeting monthly with others who had survived similar predation, creating a community of understanding and mutual support. Eleanor also began spending time with Benjamin and Duke, initially to thank them for the role they had played in her recovery, but gradually developing a genuine friendship that filled spaces in all 3 of their lives that had previously been empty. Eleanor would cook large meals and invite Benjamin and Duke to her house, would spend afternoons walking with them through the valley, would tell stories about her life and listen to Benjamin's stories in return. Their connection transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. It became something deeper, a genuine kinship between 2 people who had both survived profound losses and who recognized in each other the particular wisdom that comes from having been broken and having chosen to rebuild. Anyway, Deputy Marcus shepherded the investigation through its concluding phases with the kind of thorough professionalism that reflected both his training and his personal investment in seeing justice achieved. He worked with federal investigators, with prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions, and with victims' advocates to ensure that every aspect of Leopold's criminal operation was documented and addressed. Marcus also ensured that Benjamin's role in the investigation was properly recognized, not as a vigilante or an amateur, but as a concerned citizen whose careful documentation and cooperation with law enforcement had been instrumental in solving a complex multi-state fraud case. When the case concluded, Marcus made a point of publicly thanking Benjamin and Duke, speaking to local media about the dog's role in locating Leopold and in preventing an active shooter situation from becoming a tragedy. Marcus understood that Benjamin was a veteran, that Benjamin was Black, and that in many communities across America, the contributions of such individuals were often overlooked or minimized. Marcus was determined that would not happen in his jurisdiction. He arranged for Benjamin to be honored at a community event where the mayor presented him with a certificate of appreciation and where local media covered the story of a retired military working dog and a veteran who had worked together to protect their community. Dr. Sarah, the veterinarian who had played her own crucial role in the investigation, took particular interest in Duke's ongoing health and well-being following the shooting incident. Duke had been grazed by a bullet, and while the wound had been relatively minor, Dr. Sarah had insisted on comprehensive examination to ensure there were no complications. More significantly, Dr. Duke. Sarah had recognized that Duke, despite his extraordinary behavior during the confrontation, might be experiencing trauma from the experience. She had referred Benjamin to a specialist in animal behavioral therapy, someone who worked with military and service dogs who had experienced combat-related stress. The therapy sessions had helped Duke process the experience in a way that allowed the dog to continue functioning at his highest level without developing PTSD or behavioral problems. Dr. Sarah also used Duke's story in her veterinary practice, speaking with other dog owners about the importance of recognizing that dogs were emotional beings who could experience trauma and who required appropriate support and care in the aftermath of difficult experiences. She became an advocate for better veterinary mental health resources, and she spoke at professional conferences about the psychological dimensions of working dog health. Her involvement with Benjamin and Duke's case had deepened her understanding of the human-animal bond and had positioned her as a resource not just for physical veterinary care, but for the emotional and psychological well-being of the animals in her care. The winter that had threatened to become dangerous and tragic gradually gave way to spring, and as the snow melted and the valley transformed into something green and alive again, the significance of what had occurred began to settle into clearer perspective. Benjamin had discovered that his identity as a veteran and as a Black man, which had so often felt like a liability in the civilian world, had become an asset in this particular circumstance. His military training, his discipline, his refusal to panic in crisis, his absolute loyalty to those he cared for, all of these qualities had enabled him to see a situation through from beginning to end in a way that had resulted in genuine justice and genuine protection for someone who had been victimized. The experience had also transformed Benjamin's understanding of his own purpose. For years after military service, he had struggled to find meaningful work, to locate a reason for existing that felt as significant as the reasons that military service had provided. Through the events surrounding Eleanor and the investigation into Leopold, Benjamin had discovered that his skills and his character were still relevant, still valuable, and still capable of producing meaningful outcomes in the world. He began to explore opportunities working with veterans organizations, consulting on fraud detection and elder protection programs, using his experience to help other veterans understand how to recognize and prevent predatory behavior targeting vulnerable members of their communities. Duke's role in the events had been recognized and celebrated in ways that reflected the deep human appreciation for the extraordinary loyalty and capability of working dogs. Duke had been honored by multiple veteran and military dog organizations. He had been featured in news articles and documentary-style features that explored the bond between Benjamin and the dog. More significantly, though, Duke had found the same thing that Benjamin had found: a renewed sense of purpose. For years after his military discharge, Duke had struggled with the absence of work and mission. His entire being had been wired for purpose, for having a job to do, for the structure and meaning that military service provided. Through the events of the investigation and the confrontation with Leopold, Duke had accessed that sense of purpose again. Benjamin began to work with Duke on community safety programs, bringing the dog to schools and community centers to help educate people about fraud prevention and elder protection. Duke would demonstrate his alert behaviors, would show audiences the kinds of signals that indicated something significant and would help people understand how dogs could be partners in safety and security in ways that went far beyond simple companionship. The dog thrived in this role, his entire bearing transformed by having meaningful work to do. The story of Benjamin, Duke, and Eleanor became a kind of legend within the valley and gradually spread outward through news coverage and social media sharing. People who had experienced their own encounters with fraud or predatory behavior reached out to Eleanor to share their stories and to ask for guidance. Victims' advocacy organizations across multiple states requested permission to use the story as part of their educational programs. Universities studying elder abuse and fraud included the case in their curricula as an example of how fraud victims could achieve justice and how community members could effectively intervene in predatory situations. The story became a powerful counter-narrative to the stereotypes and assumptions that often surrounded both veterans and black men in American society. Benjamin was presented not as a threat but as a protector. He was presented not as someone receiving charity or assistance but as someone offering his skills and experience to his community. Duke was presented not as an animal to be feared but as a being capable of extraordinary loyalty, intelligence, and heroism. The story challenged people's assumptions about who deserved respect, who could be trusted, and whose contributions mattered in creating safer, more just communities. Yet beneath all the recognition and the celebration of what had been accomplished, the most profound transformation was something quieter and more intimate. Benjamin had learned to see himself not through the lens of the prejudices he had internalized from decades of subtle and overt discrimination, but rather through the lens of his own integrity and capability. He had learned that his value did not depend on others' recognition or validation, but that such recognition, when earned through genuine accomplishment, was deeply affirming. He had learned that the skills that military service had provided, discipline, analytical thinking, the ability to remain calm under pressure, absolute loyalty, were not relics of a past life, but were tools that remained relevant and powerful in his present. Duke, similarly, had learned that aging and retirement from military service did not mean the end of purpose or significance. The dog had learned that his capacity to protect, to alert, to care for Benjamin, and to contribute to his community remained undiminished by the passage of time. Most profoundly, both Benjamin and Duke had learned that their bond, forged through shared military experience, deepened through mutual recognition of trauma and survival, and tested through genuine danger, was not merely personal comfort, but was a force capable of producing real-world justice, protection for others. Eleanor's transformation was perhaps the most visibly profound. She had begun her friendship with Benjamin and Duke as someone recovering from victimization and loss. She had lived for years in a diminished state, accepting reduced circumstances as the consequence of her own judgment, carrying shame that she had intellectually recognized was misplaced but had emotionally carried nonetheless. Through her connection with Benjamin and Duke, Eleanor had begun to reclaim her sense of self-worth. She had recognized that her victimization had not been a reflection of her character or her intelligence, but rather a reflection of Leopold's predatory expertise. She had recognized that her recovery could include not just financial restitution but genuine healing and genuine growth. Eleanor had begun to date again, had started traveling to places she had always wanted to visit, had reconnected with family members she had isolated herself from, and had found joy in daily life that she thought had been permanently taken from her. She had discovered that forgiveness of Leopold, but more importantly of herself, was possible. She had discovered that aging did not have to mean diminishment, that loss could eventually transform into wisdom, and that connection with others who had also survived and transcended trauma could be profoundly healing. The case against Leopold had fundamentally altered the landscape of elder fraud, prevention and prosecution in multiple states. Prosecutors who had previously struggled to build cases against sophisticated fraud operators found that Leopold's conviction provided precedent and roadmap for pursuing similar cases. Police departments and sheriff's offices began implementing improved protocols for investigating elder fraud, recognizing that such crimes often went unreported and that community members, rather than the victims themselves, might be the ones who identified criminal activity. Veterans organizations began incorporating fraud awareness and prevention into their services to veterans, recognizing that veterans who were aging might be particularly vulnerable to predatory targeting. Federal law enforcement agencies recognized that Leopold's multi-state operation represented a pattern that was likely repeated by other sophisticated fraud operators, and they increased their focus on identifying and prosecuting such predatory schemes. The ripple effects of Benjamin's decision to investigate Eleanor's storage unit extended far beyond the immediate case, creating systemic changes in how elder abuse and fraud were recognized, reported, and prosecuted across multiple jurisdictions. On a spring morning, nearly 1 year after Benjamin had first opened that storage unit for $50, he stood on Eleanor's front porch with Duke beside him. Eleanor had invited them to brunch. She had spent the morning preparing Benjamin's favorite foods, had set a table with care and attention, and had filled her home with the kind of warmth and welcoming that comes from genuine affection. Benjamin looked at Duke, who was regarding Eleanor with the kind of focused attention that the dog reserved for people Benjamin loved. He thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment: the auction, the storage unit, the documents, Leopold, the confrontation in the snow. He thought about how a $50 investment had become a journey that had changed multiple lives, had produced justice for multiple victims, and had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his own existence. Duke pressed against Benjamin's leg, and Eleanor opened the door wide, welcoming them both inside with a smile that contained joy and gratitude and genuine friendship. In that moment, all three of them, the veteran, the dog, and the woman who had been victimized, represented something essential about the human capacity for resilience, for justice, and for the profound bonds that could form between beings who had chosen to stand for each other in the face of predatory evil. Now, before we continue to the final call to action segment, I want to share something deeply important with all of you watching. This story is not just about crime and investigation. This story is about what it means to see the humanity in everyone around us, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. Benjamin, a black veteran, was not seen as a threat by everyone in his community. Deputy Marcus saw a fellow human being deserving of respect. Dr. Sarah saw someone capable of remarkable things. Eleanor saw a friend and a protector. When we choose to see past the stereotypes and the prejudices that society teaches us, when we choose to recognize the inherent dignity and capability in people who have been systematically undervalued, we create the possibility for genuine justice and genuine community. Leopold's crimes were predatory, but his predation was not limited to financial theft. It was also predatory in its targeting of people whom society had already diminished, already rendered vulnerable through age and isolation. Our responsibility as a community is not just to prosecute those who commit such crimes, but to recognize and protect those who have been systematically rendered vulnerable by discrimination and prejudice. Benjamin and Duke teach us that loyalty, courage, and the commitment to protect others transcend the boundaries of species, transcend the boundaries of military service, and transcend the boundaries of race. They teach us that when we choose to stand with those who are being victimized, when we choose to use our skills and our resources to serve justice, we become part of something larger than ourselves. If you've experienced elder fraud, if you know someone who has been victimized by predatory behavior, please know that you are not alone, and that justice is possible. Reach out to local law enforcement, to victim advocacy organizations, to community resources dedicated to protecting vulnerable people. Share your story, because in sharing stories, we create awareness and we create prevention. If you're a veteran watching this, recognize that your skills matter, that your experience has value, and that there are ways to continue serving your community long after formal military service has ended. Reach out to veterans organizations, to community groups, to law enforcement agencies that would benefit from your expertise and your commitment to justice. Please support this channel and this mission by liking the video and subscribing so you never miss another story of courage, resilience, and the extraordinary bonds that connect us all. If this story moved you, if it resonated with something in your own life, please share it with someone you care about. Tell them why this story matters to you. In the comments below, I want to invite you to drop a comment and the number 5,050 for the dollar amount Benjamin paid for that storage unit, 50 for the years that passed before Eleanor finally found justice, 50 for every person watching who has been victimized and deserves to know that recovery is but possible. Tell us in the comments how this story affected you, what it made you think about, what it inspired you to do differently in your own community. Your voice matters. Your engagement matters. Your willingness to see and recognize the humanity and capability in people who have been systematically undervalued matters more than you can possibly know. Before you leave this video, take a moment to click on the next story that's appearing on your screen right now. There are so many more stories of veterans, of working dogs, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to create justice and protect their communities. These are stories that deserve to be heard, stories that deserve to be seen, stories that remind us all what it means to live with integrity and to stand with those who have been victimized. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these stories. Thank you for being the kind of person who recognizes that justice matters, that community matters, and that the bonds we form with each other, whether we're human or dog, whether we're military or civilian, whether we're young or old, are the most valuable things we possess. God bless all of you. And God bless the veterans and the service animals who continue to protect us all.